In a town where time moved slower than the rust on the stop signs, and where the sidewalks cracked like old bones underfoot, there lived an old woman who most people barely noticed. She wasn't the kind of person you'd see on the news or read about in the paper. No grand titles, no fancy car, no social media following. Just a quiet presence, like the hum of a refrigerator in an empty kitchen. There, steady, easy to overlook. Her house sat near the end of Maple Street, tucked between a vacant lot and a laundromat that only opened on Tuesdays. The paint had long since faded to a soft gray, and the front steps creaked with every step, as if they were whispering secrets to anyone who dared to listen. Inside, the rooms were small but tidy, filled with things that had meaning rather than value. A chipped teacup from her mother, a wool blanket stitched by her late husband, a radio that only played 2 stations but played them well. She lived alone now, not because she wanted to, but because life had a way of taking people away, some through distance, others through time. Her children had grown and scattered like dandelion seeds in the wind, each chasing their own sun. They called sometimes, sent cards on birthdays, but the house stayed quiet most days. That was all right. She'd learned how to keep herself company. She'd talk to the geranium on her windowsill, name the birds that landed on the fence, hum old songs while folding laundry. It wasn't loneliness exactly, more like a kind of quiet companionship with the rhythm of her own days. Money had always been tight but never desperate, until recently. Her pension check came like clockwork, but it barely covered the basics anymore. Groceries cost more. The electric bill crept higher each month. She'd stopped buying new clothes years ago, mending the same cardigan so many times it had more thread than original fabric. Still, she never complained. Complaining, she believed, was like pouring water into a cracked cup. It just made everything messier. One morning, as frost clung to the window panes and the air smelled like wet wool and wood smoke, she sat at her kitchen table counting coins, not because she enjoyed it, but because she had to. The jar on the counter held what was left of last month's money, mostly pennies, a few dimes, 1 nickel bent at the edge. And then, at the very bottom, a single quarter, shiny, almost defiant in its loneliness. She turned it over in her palm, feeling its weight. It wasn't much, just 25 cents, but it was all she had until the next check arrived in 12 days. 12 days of tea without milk, bread without butter. Lights kept low to save on the bill. She knew she should keep it, tuck it away for an emergency. But then she remembered the flyer she'd seen pinned to the bulletin board at the post office a few days earlier. It was simple, just black ink on white paper, but the words stuck with her. Winter is coming. Help us give warm coats to kids who don't have any. Below it was a drawing of a child wrapped in a too big sweater, shivering under a streetlight. She'd stood there longer than she meant to, staring at that drawing until her eyes blurred. She remembered what it felt like to be cold. Not just the kind that nips at your fingers, but the deep in your bones kind that makes you feel invisible. Without thinking too hard, because if she thought too hard, she might talk herself out of it. She slipped the quarter into her coat pocket, tied her scarf tight, and stepped out into the cold. The walk to the community center was 3 miles. She didn't own a car and the bus didn't run on weekends, but she didn't mind walking. It gave her time to think, to watch the world wake up. She passed houses with Christmas lights still blinking in February, a bakery where the smell of cinnamon rolls drifted through the door, a playground empty except for a lone swing swaying in the wind. Each step ached a little. Her knees weren't what they used to be, but she kept going. When she finally reached the center, her cheeks were red, her breath puffing in little clouds. The building was modest, a converted church with peeling paint and a ramp someone had built by hand. But it felt warm the moment she stepped inside. There was the sound of children laughing in the back room, the smell of soup simmering on the stove, and a sense of calm that didn't depend on how much money anyone had. A small table near the entrance had a glass jar labeled, "Coats for Kids." It wasn't fancy, just a pickle jar with a handwritten sign taped to the side. Inside were a few crumpled bills, some loose change, a hair tie, and a gum wrapper someone had accidentally dropped in. She stood there for a moment, her hand in her pocket, fingers curled around that last quarter. She didn't pray out loud, but she whispered something in her heart. Maybe a wish, maybe a thank you. Then slowly she pulled out the coin and dropped it in. It made a soft clink as it hit the bottom, louder than it should have been. She didn't expect anyone to notice. She turned to leave, already planning how she'd stretch her tea leaves for the next week, but someone had seen. From the hallway, a man in a worn flannel shirt had paused, coffee mug in hand. He'd watched her walk in, watched her hesitate, watched her give away the only thing she had left. He didn't say anything, didn't approach her, but his throat tightened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something shift inside him, like a door opening in a room he'd forgotten existed. She walked back home the same way she'd come, shoulders a little lighter even though her pockets were empty. The sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows that danced beside her. She didn't know it yet, but that one small act, quiet, unseen, uncelebrated, was about to ripple outward in ways no one could predict. And the next morning, the whole town would be waiting. The man in the flannel shirt didn't post anything right away. He just stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the pickle jar on the table like it held something sacred. He'd run the community center for nearly a decade, ever since he'd walked away from a job that paid well but left him feeling hollow. Back then, he'd thought he was doing good by organizing food drives and tutoring kids after school. But watching that woman, thin as a winter branch, eyes tired but kind, drop her last coin into that jar made him realize something. Generosity wasn't about how much you gave. It was about what it cost you. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she lived or what she ate for dinner. But he knew this. She'd chosen to give when she had every reason not to. And that kind of quiet courage deserved to be remembered. Not shouted from rooftops, not turned into a spectacle, but passed along like a warm coat handed from one person to another on a cold day. Later that afternoon, while sorting donated socks and mismatched gloves, he sat down at the old desktop computer in the back office. He didn't open social media, didn't write a press release. Instead, he typed a short note on the town's community board, a simple online forum where people posted about lost dogs, garage sales, and who needed help shoveling snow. Saw something today that reminded me why we do this. An older woman came in this morning. Didn't say much, just dropped her last quarter into the Coats for Kids jar. Walked 3 miles to get here. Didn't ask for anything, just gave. If you've got a coat, $1, or even just a kind word to share this winter, now's the time. He hit post and went back to folding sweaters. He didn't expect much to come of it. Maybe a few extra donations. Maybe someone would recognize her and check in. That was enough. But the internet, for all its noise, sometimes carries quiet things further than anyone expects. By evening, someone had screenshotted the post and shared it in a local parents group. A retired school bus driver read it over dinner and told his neighbor while walking their dogs. The neighbor mentioned it to the cashier at the grocery store, who told her cousin, who ran a small auto repair shop. Word traveled not like wildfire, but like mist. Soft, steady, seeping into corners people didn't even know were empty. One high school student, home from basketball practice, saw the post on her phone. She'd been scrolling mindlessly, half watching a reality show when the words stopped her. She thought of her little brother, who'd worn the same puffy jacket for 3 winters straight. She grabbed her camera, just her phone, nothing fancy, and recorded a 30-second video in her room. No script, no filters. Just her sitting on her bed saying, "My grandma used to say, if you can't give money, give your hands. If you can't give hands, give your heart." Today, someone gave all 3. Let's not forget her. She posted it with the original note and went to bed. She didn't think anyone would watch it. But by midnight, it had been shared over 200 times. Meanwhile, in a diner on the edge of town, 2 mechanics sat over coffee after a long shift. One of them pulled out his phone and showed the other the video. "That's got to be Mrs. L," he said quietly. "Lives on Maple near the old laundromat. Saw her walking last week with that red scarf." The other man nodded. "Yeah, heard she's alone out there. Heater's been acting up for years." They didn't say much after that. Just finished their coffee, left a generous tip, and walked out into the cold night with something new in their chests. Not guilt, not pity, but a quiet urge to do something real. Back at the community center, the donation jar began to fill. Not with grand gestures, but with small ones. A $5 bill tucked under a note that read, "For the lady with the red scarf." A child's drawing of a smiling sun with the words, "Thank you for being kind." A brand new winter coat, still in the bag, left anonymously at the door with a tag that said, "Size 6 for someone who gives everything." The man in the flannel shirt didn't take credit, didn't even mention the post again. But he started keeping a second jar, this one labeled "for her," just in case. What surprised everyone wasn't how fast the story spread, but how gently it landed. There were no headlines, no news vans, no one trying to turn the woman into a symbol or a sob story. People just remembered. And in remembering, they wanted to be better. Not for cameras, not for likes, but because something about her act had brushed against the part of them that still believed in quiet goodness. Librarian printed out copies of the original, post and taped them to the bulletin board inside the library, next to flyers for story hour and book clubs. A bakery started a pay-it-forward coffee board, where customers could buy a hot drink for someone who might need it the next day. A group of teenagers organized a coat drive at their school, not because it was required, but because they'd seen the video and felt something stir inside them, something hopeful. And through it all, the woman herself knew nothing of it. She was home, boiling water for tea, mending a tear in her only pair of gloves, wondering if she could stretch her crackers to last another 2 days. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't even feel like she'd done anything special. She'd just seen a need and tried to meet it, the best she could with what she had. But that's often how the deepest ripples start, not with a splash, but with a single drop falling into still water. By the time the moon rose high and the town settled into sleep, something had shifted. Not in a dramatic way. No sirens, no speeches, just a quiet understanding passing between neighbors, strangers, even people who'd never met. If someone can give their last coin, the least we can do is make sure they never have to. And so, while the woman slept under a thin blanket, dreaming of spring and the smell of rain on warm pavement, dozens of people were already making plans. Small, practical, human plans to show up the next morning, not to fix her life, not to take over, just to stand beside her for once instead of walking past. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person choosing kindness in the dark to remind everyone else how to find the light. She woke before sunrise, like she always did. Not because an alarm told her to, but because her body had learned the rhythm of daylight long ago. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the distant hum of a refrigerator that had seen better decades. She lay still for a moment, listening to the silence, feeling the cold seep through the thin blanket. Winter hadn't let go yet, and the heater in the corner had been making that coughing sound again. Like it was tired, just like her. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, feet meeting the worn rug beneath. The floorboards groaned in familiar places as she shuffled to the window and pulled back the curtain, expecting the usual. Empty street, frost on the parked cars, maybe a stray cat darting between fences. But what she saw made her freeze. Her breath caught in her throat. Dozens of cars. Not just a few, not just neighbors stopping by. Dozens, lined up on both sides of the street, bumper to bumper, stretching as far as she could see. Trucks, sedans, old station wagons with rust on the fenders. Even a bright blue van with a dented door. Engines off. No honking, no shouting. Just stillness, and beside each car, people stood. Not a crowd, not a mob. Just people. Men in work boots holding grocery bags. Women with scarves wrapped tight around their necks, arms full of blankets. A teenager balancing a small keyboard on one knee. An older man leaning on a cane holding a thermos. No cameras, no signs. No one calling out her name. They just stood there, waiting. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, pulled the curtain shut, then opened it again. Still there. Her first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. Had she missed something? Was there a parade? A town meeting? But Maple Street never hosted anything. It was just a quiet road where people came home, not where they gathered. She stepped back, heart thudding. Maybe it wasn't for her. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they'd mistaken her house for someone else's. She glanced down at her robe, faded, patched at the elbow, and suddenly felt too small for whatever was happening outside. But then she saw him, the man from the community center. Standing near the front of the line, holding a paper bag that smelled faintly of cinnamon, he caught her eye through the window and gave a small, gentle nod. Not a wave, not a performance, just a quiet acknowledgement, like he was saying, "It's okay, we're here because of you." And then it clicked. The quarter, the jar, the walk. She hadn't thought anyone noticed. She hadn't wanted anyone to, but someone had. and that someone had told others, and those others had told more, until here they all were, on her street, in the pale morning light, bringing pieces of their lives to share with hers. She didn't know what to do. She wasn't used to being seen, let alone honored. For years she'd moved through the world like a shadow, polite, invisible, careful not to take up too much space. But this was the opposite of invisible. She took a deep breath, smoothed her hair with trembling hands, and walked to the front door. The moment she opened it, the street didn't erupt in cheers. There was no applause, just a soft ripple of movement as people stepped forward, not all at once but one by one, like they were giving her space to breathe. The man from the center was first. He handed her the bag. "Fresh rolls," he said simply. "From the bakery on Elm," they insisted. She took it, fingers brushing the warm paper. I don't understand," she whispered. "You gave when you had nothing left," he said. People wanted to give back. Behind him, a woman with kind eyes held out a basket. "Got eggs, oatmeal, some canned soup. Nothing fancy, but it'll keep you fed for a while." A young man in a mechanic's jacket stepped up next, holding a toolbox. "Heard your heater's acting up." "I'll take a look. Won't take long." Someone else placed a stack of firewood by her porch. Another left a potted plant with tiny white flowers just starting to bloom. A little girl no older than 6 ran forward and pressed a handmade card into her hand before darting back to her mother's side. The card read in wobbly letters, "You are brave. I drew you a son." She stood there, arms full, tears welling but not falling. Not out of sadness, not even out of joy, but out of something deeper, something like relief. The kind that comes when you realize you haven't been forgotten after all. No one asked for a speech. No one demanded a photo. They just began. The mechanic went inside to check the furnace. 2 women started unloading groceries into her kitchen. A retired teacher sat on the porch step and asked if she'd like company, while they waited for the coffee to brew. The teenager with the keyboard set it up under the bare oak tree and started playing a soft, wordless melody. Nothing showy, just something warm and steady, like a heartbeat. She didn't have to say much. Didn't have to perform gratitude. They didn't need her to be anything other than herself. Tired, humble, human. And that was the most surprising part. This wasn't charity in the way she'd seen it before. Distant, transactional, tinged with pity. This felt like kinship, like someone had looked at her life and said, "You matter," not because of what she could offer, but simply because she existed. As the sun climbed higher, painting the street gold, the line of cars didn't shrink. More people arrived. A nurse brought blood pressure cuffs and vitamins. A gardener offered to fix her broken trellis come spring. Someone had even brought a second-hand radio. Better reception, they said, so she could hear the weather report clearly. She kept saying thank you, but the words felt too small. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She made tea. Strong, hot, the way her mother used to. She filled every cup she owned, even the chipped one, and carried them out to the porch. One by one, people accepted, not because they were thirsty, but because they understood. This was her way of saying, "I see you too," and in that quiet exchange, tea for kindness, presence for presence. The street didn't feel like a spectacle anymore. It felt like home. Not just hers, but theirs. A place where giving wasn't about grand gestures, but about showing up, fully and gently, for someone who'd shown up for others when no one was watching. She didn't know it yet, but this morning wouldn't be the end of something. It would be the beginning of visits, of shared meals, of phone calls just to say hello, of a community remembering that care doesn't always come with a price tag. Sometimes it comes with a quarter. And a whole lot of heart. The days that followed didn't feel like a miracle, not in the flashy, lightning from the sky kind of way. There were no banners, no interviews, no sudden windfalls that changed everything overnight. Instead, what happened was slower, quieter, like the way sunlight fills a room when you finally open the curtains after years of keeping them drawn. It wasn't about fixing her life from the outside in. It was about weaving her back into the fabric of the town, thread by careful thread. People didn't swarm her house every day. That would have been too much, too fast. But they came, regularly, gently. The mechanic returned the next week with a friend, and together they patched the roof where rain had been sneaking in for years. They didn't make a show of it. Just showed up with ladders and tools, whistling while they worked, refusing payment but accepting a slice of the apple cake she'd baked using eggs someone had left on her step. The retired nurse began stopping by every Tuesday morning, not just to check her blood pressure, but to sit with her over tea and talk about books, old movies, the way lilacs used to bloom thicker along the riverbank before the drought started. They never spoke about loneliness, but somehow in those quiet conversations, it lessened, like a weight shared becomes lighter for both. A high school student started visiting after school, not because she was assigned to, but because she'd seen the video and felt something stir inside her. She'd bring her sketchbook and sit on the porch drawing the way the light hit the geraniums or the curve of the old oak tree. Sometimes they'd talk. Sometimes they'd just sit in comfortable silence. And one afternoon, the student taught her how to make a video call. At first, she fumbled with the phone, nervous and unsure, but then her nephew's face appeared on the screen, older with lines around his eyes she didn't recognize, and he said, "Auntie? Is that really you?" She cried then, not from sadness, but from the sheer relief of being seen by someone who remembered her voice. No one treated her like a project. No one acted like she needed saving. They simply remembered she existed, and that made all the difference. Inside her home, small changes began to take root. The heater purred steadily now, thanks to parts donated by the auto shop and labor given freely. The pantry, once nearly empty, held jars of soup, boxes of pasta, bags of rice, each labeled with a sticky note. "For your tea days. Try this stew, it's my grandma's recipe. Oatmeal plus honey. Good mornings." Even the electricity bill arrived with a note from the utility company saying her account had been covered for the next 6 months, courtesy of neighbors who care. But the real shift wasn't in the things. It was in the rhythm of her days. She no longer counted coins. She no longer rationed crackers or skipped meals to stretch her pension. Not because she suddenly had money, but because she wasn't alone in carrying the weight anymore. And with that weight lifted, something unexpected bloomed inside her. Energy. Not the frantic kind, but the calm, steady kind that comes when you feel safe. She started baking again, something she hadn't done in years. Not fancy cakes, just simple loaves of banana bread or oat cookies. And every time she did, she'd wrap a portion in wax paper and leave it on someone's porch. The nurses, the mechanics, the students. No note. Just a quiet return of kindness, like tossing a pebble into a pond and watching the ripples go out. The community center became a second home. She didn't just drop by to donate anymore. She stayed. Helped sort winter coats, folded donated clothes, even read stories to the younger kids during after-school hours. Her voice, once soft from disuse, grew stronger. The children called her Miss L, not out of formality but affection. They liked how she remembered their names, how she never rushed them, how she always had a spare button or hair tie in her pocket, just in case. And slowly, without fanfare, the town began to change, not just for her, but because of her. People started noticing each other more. A man who used to hurry past the bus stop began offering rides to seniors on rainy days. A grocery clerk started setting aside slightly bruised fruit for families she knew were struggling. Someone organized a warm hands drive, collecting gloves and scarves not just for kids, but for anyone who needed them. The community board online filled not just with requests, but with offers. Got extra firewood, happy to deliver, can babysit Tuesday nights, need someone to walk your dog while you're at the hospital. It wasn't perfection. There were still hard days. Bills still came. Winter still bit, but something had shifted in the air. Like the town had remembered an old language it had nearly forgotten. The language of showing up. Back at her house, the porch light stayed on longer each evening. Not because she was afraid of the dark, but because she liked seeing the street alive with movement. The neighbor walking her dog, kids biking home from practice, the soft glow of windows where people were cooking dinner, laughing, living. She felt part of it now, not as a recipient, but as a thread in the weave. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching fireflies blink in the dusk, the man from the community center stopped by. He didn't bring anything, just sat beside her on the step. "You know," he said after a while, "I thought that post was just about you giving a quarter." She smiled. "And what do you think now?" "I think it was about all of us remembering how to give a little piece of ourselves." She nodded, sipping her tea. "Funny how one small thing can open a door." "Funny," he agreed. "How we all needed someone to walk through it first, They sat in silence then, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of life continuing. No grand declarations, no speeches, just two people side by side, in a world that had grown kinder, not because of a single act, but because that act reminded everyone what they were capable of. And in that quiet moment, she realized something. She hadn't been rescued. She'd been welcomed back, not as a symbol, not as a story, but as herself, flawed, aging, ordinary, and deeply human. And that was more than enough. Winter didn't vanish overnight. The morning still came sharp with frost, and the wind still carried that bite that slipped through even the thickest coats. But something had changed, not in the weather, but in the way people moved through it. The town had grown warmer, not because the sun shone brighter, but because its people had learned to carry a little more light between them. She noticed it first in the small things. The way the post office clerk would slip an extra stamp into her envelope, just in case. How the bus driver now paused a few seconds longer at her stop when he saw her walking up the sidewalk, even though she never rode the bus. The way neighbors waved not just out of politeness, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as if to say, "I see you, and I'm glad you're here." But the real shift showed up at the community center. The donation jar for winter coats had long since overflowed. They'd moved it to a bigger container, a clean plastic tub with a lid, and still people kept giving. Not just coats anymore, but boots, hats, gloves, even backpacks filled with school supplies. And tucked among the donations were notes. Dozens of them. Some on notebook paper, others on the backs of receipts or grocery lists. All of them said something like, "For the lady who gave her last coin," or "because of you," or simply, "Pay it forward." She'd read them quietly when no one was looking, her fingers tracing the words like they were prayers. She never said anything about them out loud, but they stayed with her. Tiny reminders that kindness once planted doesn't just sit still. It grows, it spreads, it finds new soil. One afternoon, as snow began to dust the streets in soft white flakes, she walked to the center again. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She carried a small package wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. Inside was a scarf, hand-knitted from yarn someone had given her weeks ago. She'd stayed up late finishing it, her fingers stiff but determined, choosing deep reds and soft creams, colors that reminded her of sunrise and warmth. When she arrived, a line of children stood near the coat rack, waiting to be matched with winter gear. Most were quiet, eyes downcast, shoulders hunched against the cold and the weight of being small in a big, uncertain world. She watched them for a moment, remembering that drawing on the flyer, the shivering child under the streetlight, and felt that familiar tug in her chest. Then she saw him. A boy, no older than 7, stood at the end of the line, arms crossed tightly over his chest like he was trying to hold himself together. His shoes were thin, his jacket too small, and his ears were bright red from the cold. He didn't look up when she approached, just stared at the floor like it might swallow him whole. She didn't say anything grand, didn't make a speech. She simply walked over, knelt, slowly, carefully so as not to startle him, and held out the scarf. "It's soft," she said gently. "Won't itch your neck." He looked up then, eyes wide, unsure. She smiled, not too big, just enough to say, "It's okay." He reached out, fingers brushing the wool, then took it. For a moment he just held it, as if testing whether it was real. Then without a word he wrapped it around his neck, pulling it up to his chin like a shield. She didn't ask his name, didn't pat his head or tell him to stay warm. She just stood, brushed a bit of snow from her coat, and nodded. And in that quiet exchange, no cameras, no audience, just two humans meeting in the middle of a hard season, something passed between them. Not pity, not charity, just care, simple, unspoken human care. Later, as she walked home through the falling snow, she passed the same playground she'd walked by weeks before. This time it wasn't empty. A group of kids were building a lopsided snowman, laughing as snowballs flew. One of them waved at her. She waved back. Back at her house, the porch light was already on. Someone had turned it on for her earlier, knowing she'd be out late. Inside, the heater hummed steadily. The kettle whistled softly on the stove, and on the kitchen table sat a loaf of fresh bread from the bakery, wrapped in a cloth with a note. "For your tea. You've earned it." She made her tea, sat by the window, and watched the snow fall. The street was quiet again, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful, full. Because the truth was, the story hadn't ended that morning when the cars lined the street. That wasn't the finale, it was the beginning. The real story was in what came after. The slow, steady return of connection. The way people started looking out for each other, not because they were asked to, but because they remembered what it felt like to be seen. And she, in her quiet way, had become part of something bigger than herself. Not as a hero, not as a symbol, but as a reminder. A living, breathing reminder that generosity isn't about how much you have. It's about what you're willing to give when you think you have nothing left. Weeks turned into months. Spring arrived with hesitant warmth, melting the last of the snow and coaxing green shoots from the earth. The geranium on her windowsill bloomed again, bright red against the glass. She started tending a small garden in the backyard. Just herbs at first, then tomatoes, then marigolds along the fence. Neighbors would stop by to admire it, and sometimes they'd stay for tea. The community center launched a new program, Neighbor Notes, where people could leave messages of thanks, offers of help, or just words of encouragement for anyone who needed them. The board filled quickly, and at the very top someone had pinned a faded quarter to a piece of cardstock with the words, "This started it all." She never took credit, never sought attention, but every time she walked past that board she'd pause just for a second and touch the edge of that card with her fingertips, like a quiet hello to the moment that changed everything. Life didn't become perfect. There were still bills, still quiet nights, still days when the world felt heavy. But now she carried it differently. Not alone, not in silence, but with the steady knowledge that she belonged to this street, this town, this web of ordinary people choosing kindness again and again. And on the days when the weight felt too much, someone always showed up. Sometimes with soup, sometimes with a book, sometimes just to sit in silence on the porch watching the sky change color. That was the real miracle. Not the cars, not the donations, not even the scarf on the boy's neck. It was the return of something people had almost forgotten, that were meant to carry each other. And in the end, that single quarter hadn't just bought a coat. It had bought back a little piece of the town's soul. She sipped her tea, smiled at the snow melting into the soil, and whispered, just loud enough for the walls to hear, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, just to life itself, for letting her be part of something beautiful simply by being kind when no one was watching.